International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, and today I'm doing the second edition of my chess studies series. Actually, I was intending only to do one lecture on studies, or etudes as they're also called, but because there's been a lot of positive feedback on this, I've decided to do a second edition and show some more studies, and I'm very happy to also. I like showing these studies. I haven't tried to create any of my own, but maybe sometime in the future, but that's not so easy. You have to have a lot of creativity to come up with some of these ideas. So here's the first one. This is by M.G. Klatskin from 1924, and it's white to move here, as it is in almost every study. And we have a fairly normal-looking position, of not not a boring position, but something that could happen during a game. And we see that black is up a piece, but his knight is stuck because it's defending the rook, and it doesn't look like white has so many losing chances here. For example, if white wanted to draw, he could take the rook, black takes back, king takes a7, and now simplest way for black to draw would be king takes c6, king takes a8, and king b5, and the last pawn is removed, so it's a draw. But once we've seen a draw, now we look for a way to win. So, of course, if white takes the knight here, black would take the rook. And now, if c7, then black can take on b6 with check, and actually black wins now. Meanwhile, if b takes a7, black can simply play rook to c8 looks okay, or perhaps simply rook to a8, actually, simplest. Rook to a8, and if king to b7, then rook takes a7, king takes a7, king takes c6 again with a draw. So, white needs to find a way to break this down, and he would like to take the knight with check. So, at some point you need to have some sort of kind of vision to just see some move that comes to mind. You look at different threats, different ways of creating threats, or checks and captures also, and we see that there's a move c7. This can't fail to come to mind, and now we start to calculate, because if black takes the pawn, white takes a knight with check. So, let's try c7. Now white's threat is to simply take the rook, followed by making a new queen on c8, winning. Also, a takes b6 is the threat, after which white would queen a pawn. So, it turns out black has only one way to meet these threats, and that's to take the pawn on c7. If anything else, white simply takes on b6 or on a8. So king takes c7 is the only move. And now, again, rook takes a8 is of course a draw. Black simply takes back, and king takes c7, and it's a draw. So white takes the knight with check. Now black has to take the rook with the king. Of course, his own rook is under attack, so he takes the rook with a king. And now, nice final position, b7. And here, it's zugzwang, of course. It's a mutual zugzwang also. If it was white's move, he would have to take on a8 with a draw. But it's black's move, so he has only one legal move, king to c7, and now we take the rook and make a queen, and white wins. It's a very nice position with pawn defeating rook and another pawn, and it comes from quite a normal starting position too. This is what I particularly like. This one's a fairly simple study. Next one is kind of interesting also, and this one has to do with some endgame theory. Okay, this study is by Gia Nadarashvili. from 1958. And we have, again, white to move here. And, well, this position is a little bit easier to understand when you first look at it. It's 3 pieces against a queen. And typically, 3 pieces against a queen is a draw. With no pawns, of course. But only if the pieces are linked together. Here we have 3 unprotected pieces on far different parts of the board, and it seems clear white's going to lose at least one of them. And then the 2 pieces, certain positions can be a draw with only knight and bishop, for example, or knight and knight against a queen. But I don't think we can get to that type of position, because still, to coordinate even 2 of the pieces is pretty hard. So white needs to start calculating and see if we can find some resources in the future. We have a few checks available here. And 2 knights are always good for forking. Even though black's king and queen are pretty far apart, you find that the king can be drawn to certain squares, and even quite far forks can become possible. So, start off with white's knight is hanging, the bishop is hanging, and the knight also on e2 even can be lost by some forks of the queen. So white pretty much needs to play knight to b4 check and see what we can do in the future. So knight to b4 check. And now the black king has to choose carefully where it's going to go. Because if king b7, then knight to d6 check, and it's white that wins. We have 3 pieces against the king. We only need 2 of them. I mean, the knight and bishop, of course. So, same thing with king to b5. After king to b5, knight to d6 check, and white wins again. Knight and bishop versus king. So there's only one move that black can play, king a5. Now, again, white has all 3 pieces under attack, so we need to continue. Knight to c6 check. And again, black needs to be careful. First of all, king a6. After king a6, white can play knight to b4, and we're back where we were just last move, so it's a repetition of position. So he's not making any progress that way. And king to b5, again, would lose to knight to d4 check, followed by knight takes queen. So, again, black is left with only one other possible move to play for a win, king a4. And white needs to continue now with knight to b6 check again. Now, still, black has the same problem. If king to b5, then knight to d4 check, and white wins. Same thing after king to b3, knight to d4 check. So yet again, only one possible move, king to a3. Now, once again, white's bishop is under attack. If the bishop moves, of course, queen f6 check, followed by queen takes c6. White simply has to keep going. He has to find some way to link his pieces together, or to get perpetual check, so he checks on c4. And now, if king to a4, white can repeat back with knight to b6 check. So, actually, after king a4, there's even better move. Knight to b6 check would allow repetition, but bishop to d1 check, interestingly enough, would win, because black is forced to go to b5, after which white checks either on d4 or d6, and wins black's queen. So, king a4 is only a loss for black, and king to b3, again, leads to a loss, knight to d4 check. So he needs to play king a2. But now it seems like white has a problem here. Because if white continues as he's been doing, with knight to b4 check, then black can play king to b3, and now there is no fork. Both knights and the bishop are under attack, and white's losing material here. There's no neat trick in this position. So, seems like a big problem here. But now white hits on an incredibly brilliant move that links his pieces together. Bishop to f3. This is very nice. It seems like, okay, white's still losing some pieces. Black can either take the knight on c4 by queen to f8 followed by queen to f7, or he can take immediately on f3. Of course, if black takes nothing, he can give it as many checks as he wants. White's king stays on h8 or h7 or g8. But if he does nothing, if he makes a quiet move at any point, then white simply will move a knight to e5, and the pieces will all be linked, and black will have no chance of winning. The pieces will simply form a barricade to black's king. He can't even get close to white's king, so black has to take something. So let's first try taking on c4. Does this by queen to f8 check, king to h7, and queen to f7 check. White simply goes back to h8. Black can check as much as he wants, but white simply stays in the corner. And now queen takes c4. However, this leads to a draw after a very nice tactic. Bishop to d5. Now the queen is pinned, so black takes the bishop, and now knight to b4 check, followed by knight takes queen, and it's a draw. So taking on c4 doesn't work. Let's try taking on f3. Queen takes on f3, and now white checks on b4. Now we've got the queen where we want it. If black plays king to b3, white plays knight to d2 check, winning the queen and drawing. Same thing happens after king to b1. Knight to d2 check, followed by knight takes queen, and two knights against the king. It's a draw also. So black can play king a1, the only other legal move. But now white plays knight to c2 check. And again, if king to b1, knight to d2, wins black's queen and draws. So the only other move is king a2, but then white checks again on b4. And we have a repetition, and it's perpetual check. So very unique final position, with two knights drawing by perpetual check in a position where black has king and queen. It's a very interesting situation. I liked this study a lot. This was by Gia Nadarashvili, 1958. Okay, this study is by K.A.L. Kubel, fairly famous study composer. It's from 1924. And we have in front of us, admittedly, fairly unusual-looking position, but it's not completely absurd either. Black here is up a queen for two pieces, and it looks like he's about to, he stands to win. But we notice the one major defect of his position is his strangely placed king on d3 has only the c2 squared to go to. And if, for example, white's e-pawn were not there, it would be checkmate. So if the black king were at any normal square, so c7, let's say, it would be easily winning, of course. But here white can try to use black's king position to advantage. So I particularly like these type of studies also because we see some mating patterns, and any kind of mating pattern can happen in a game. And remember the Fritz versus Kramnik game, where Kramnik didn't see the mate on h7 with a knight on f8 because it's a somewhat unusual mating pattern, just people suggested. Normally the knight would be on f6 or g5, but so it's very useful for your practical chess to become acquainted with some other mating positions also. So this study is not easy to solve either. I wouldn't really say that a normal person, or even probably a computer, would be beyond its horizon, could solve it from the starting position without trying a lot of different things. But anyway, so to get some attack against black's king, we need to either swing the knight around, and for example, it could go through b4, could be checkmate, or c5 if white's king is on d1 guarding c2, and also to open up the diagonal for white's light squared bishop, the h7 d1 diagonal. So white kind of needs to act quickly, of course, otherwise black king will go to c2, or black will take on g4 or something. So the idea of king d1 doesn't work because black can take on g4, for example. So white starts off with a forcing move that also is trying to clear the e pawns out of the way, e6. And now, if black ignores the pawn, for example, let's say he takes on a4, then e5 is checkmate. So black needs to attack the bishop by taking the e-pawn. There's really no other way to defend here. And now e5 doesn't work, of course, because of queen takes g6. So white needs to protect the bishop. How are we going to protect it? Knight e7 looks like a nice move here. Knight e7, and of course if black takes the knight, then e5 is checkmate. However, we need to look at other defenses. Black can simply play king to c2, and now his king has reached open spaces. And white's knight is under attack, and the bishop is protected by the knight, so game is over. White loses yet another piece. So knight takes e7 doesn't work. We need to do something more forcing and protect the bishop at the same time. So bishop to f5. And again, taking the knight is not possible for black because e5 checkmate would be the answer. So, meanwhile, if black moves his queen to some square, anywhere, say a6, then e5 yet again is checkmate. So he has to blockade the e-pawn. He has to play queen queen e5. So now, white's efforts are going to revolve around removing the black queen from e5. However, we can't do that right away because black threatens to play king c2 and reach some open air. So right now we play the only move here for white that can be considered really, king to d1. Nice move. And now the black king is completely trapped, and the queen can't move either, and black has no checks. So he needs to do something else, move one of the pawns. What if, for example, black plays a5, then white can play knight takes e7 here. And black is stuck. He has no moves. His queen has to move, and then white plays e5. So black needs to play e6 here, attacking the bishop yet again. And white, of course, can't lose this bishop, so plays bishop to g6. And again, black is stuck for a move. If he pushes his a-pawn, white can simply play knight e7. And black is in zugzwang. e5 is coming after the queen moves. So it's an interesting situation with many zugzwangs. And after a6, this would be, if white plays knight e7, for example, then black can play a5, and he's lost a tempo. And now, looks like probably black wins, although I could check everything, but knight c6, he can play queen g7, and it looks like black defends here. Although I'm not sure. But the simplest win would be a5 here for white, keeping black in zugzwang. So black plays after bishop g6, queen g7. Nice attempt. He's once again attacking the bishop, and thus e5 doesn't work. And the bishop is running out of squares also, so white now plays knight e7, protecting the bishop. And again, black can't take the knight because of e5, checkmate. So, after knight e7, white's threatening to play e5 and win black's queen, force him to sacrifice on g6, after which white will win easily with an extra knight. So, it seems like there's no defense except if black has e5. e5 now is blocking this e-pawn permanently. It's not going anywhere, it seems. White's e-pawn is, so it seems like black has solved all of his problems. And simply take the knight, after which there can't be any more problems here. But suddenly the knight comes around from the other side. Knight to c6. And the threat is knight to b4 mate. And if black takes the bishop, not knight to b4, since now black can take on e4, but we have knight takes e5, followed by knight takes queen with a simple win. So black has to guard the b4 square. Only one way to do that, and that's a5. So yet again, it seems white has reached an impasse. He can't seemingly do anything, but now comes yet another zugzwang. He takes on e5, forcing black to take back, and now bishop f5. So, zugzwang. If the queen moves, white plays e5. The king can't move, so it seems like it's over, but black can give white some more problems. Of course, any move with the queen is met by e5, but there is one move. There's queen takes e4. So now white needs to find a very nice idea. Of course, if bishop takes queen, king takes bishop, and white's up a pawn, but he's losing the g4 pawn. So it's not winning, that's for certain. So what is white going to do? Well, it's a very nice move. King to c1, keeping black stuck, forcing black to take on f5, since now black is yet again, for what, the sixth time maybe, in zugzwang. If he plays king e2, now white takes the queen, and with this simple extra bishop he wins. So black has to take on f5, the only other legal move. And now white takes, and black can't catch the f-pawn, but his own g-pawn comes, g4, and seemingly he's queening at the same time and also with check. But then white plays king d1, back again. We see that white is catching black's g-pawn and black is not catching white's f-pawn. So this is the final position. Of course, king e4, f6, g3, king e2 wins. And if king f3, white promotes with check. Not that he needs to either. So this was a fairly long and complicated study, but these repeated zugzwangs are very nice, I think. Now, next one. The next one is by M.B. Newman. It's from 1913. It's white's move here, and we have knight and bishop versus queen, and also two pawns for white. But again, his pieces are loose, so it's somewhat similar to the earlier position. So it seems like there's no hope of victory, and maybe white should think about how to create a fortress, perhaps. But then white hits on a spectacular move here, and I think that this type of move, it's not possible to just reason it out, but it's something that comes to your mind after you've spent a lot of time looking at different combinations and looking at and playing chess and studying chess. You start to get a vision, a sense for the type of move that might be winning. So I'm talking about bishop to b5 check. For one thing, you see that if king takes bishop, knight to d6 forks. So, and if queen takes bishop, then knight to c3. So we've seen those two ideas, and there's only one other capture, and it's with the knight, and then blocks and escape square. So this is something that you just have to kind of train yourself to see these type of moves and look at them at some point. Plus, it's always a good idea to look at checks and captures during a game for you and your opponent. So most forcing moves have the most likelihood that they'll lead to something. So here, if after bishop b5 check, we'll look at each one of those lines. Okay, so if king takes bishop, this is the simplest line. White simply plays knight to d6 check, and knight takes queen, and now with an extra knight and two pawns, white wins easily. If king takes a3, white takes the queen, and again wins easily. blocked an escape square, so we kind of get the sense that there might be mate here. So knight to c5 check. And black has two ways to go. If king takes a3, then knight to c2 is mate. And if king to a5, knight to c4 is mate. So we've seen some somewhat unusual mating patterns. So he can't take with a knight. The only last move that he has is queen takes bishop. So he's going to end up with a knight against a pawn. White will have an extra pawn on h5. Question is, can he promote it, or can black's knight get back in time? So after queen takes bishop, knight to c3 check. Now black should take on a3. If he plays, for example, king to b3, white takes on b5. Black takes back on b5. Now h6. And the knight comes and stops the pawn after knight f7, but now white plays a nice move, knight to c2. And this way, he's able to keep the a pawn. Black can't take the knight, because then a4, and the king can't stop the pawn, and the knight can't either, because it has to guard the h8 square. So, of course, if white keeps the a pawn, he wins easily. Black's king will slowly be forced back, and basically have knight and pawn against the king, because the black knight is stuck on f7. So that doesn't work, so he needs to remove the a pawn. So king takes a3. Now knight takes b5. Black has to take. And now the question is, can the knight stop the pawn? Well, h6, knight d6, needs to get back to f7. It's the only square from which he can stop the pawn. And now if h7, then knight f7, and this is a draw. The knight has stopped the pawn. If white's knight approaches, for example, black can play knight h8, and the king will simply come back and take the pawn. Black has the opposition. So after knight to d6, though, instead of h7, white has a nice move. Knight to c4 check. Deflecting black's knight away. It's a fork, so black has to take it, and then h7, and white queens the pawn. And king and queen against king and knight is an easy win. So this was a fairly nice study here. And now, for the final one, this one is very nice because it looks just like a normal position. This study is by Somov Nasimovich, and it's from 1936. And it looks just like a normal position, which is, this is very nice, and I like this study a lot. First of all, it's white's move here, and it seems at first sight, well, we have equal material. You can see that, yes, black has a bishop versus a knight in an open position, so clearly has a better chances here. And then we see that white has a bigger problem, though, than simply positional advantage for black. So that he has a problem on this a7 g1 diagonal. His knight is pinned, it's under attack, so white has to defend it now. And his rook is on c5 also, so after white defends the knight, black's going to have bishop to b6 attacking the rook, and behind it the knight. So suddenly we think, well, white's probably lost here. So this one is actually white to play and draw. And white needs to protect the knight. Of course, if king to g2, then perhaps the simplest one would simply be rook takes f2 check, followed by, after king takes, bishop b6. And black takes on c5. An important point is that the a1 square is a dark square. So, of course, if it were a light square, or if the bishop were on the light squares, then white could simply move his king down to the corner and draw. But here, when the bishop is controlling the corner square, that means it's a win for black. So king to g2 won't work. King to g1 also doesn't work because of bishop to b6. And if knight d3, then black can play rook c2. Okay? And if rook h5 check, black attacks the rook. Now knight is attacked, rook is attacked. Needs to play rook h2 to guard them both. But then, typical tactic here, black takes on f2 with a rook. White takes back. Now his rook is in a pin. Black doesn't take it immediately, though. He wins a tempo by playing a5. And pawn threatens to simply march down. White has to move the king to get out of the pin. Now black takes the rook. And after king takes the bishop on f2, black plays a4. And white can't stop the pawn. His own f-pawn isn't going anywhere. So it looks like a bad situation for white here. But we have another move we can try here. We can try king to g3. This avoids having the knight be pinned. So if now black plays bishop b6, seemingly decisive, the move white has knight to d3, attacking black's rook. And then after the rook moves, white can play rook to d5 and holds a draw easily. So after king to g3, if black wants to try to win, he needs to play the other way of exploiting this white's problem on this a7 g1 diagonal. Rook takes f2. So now, of course, if white takes the rook, then bishop to b6 wins the game, as before. So white can't take on f2. He needs to first get his rook out of trouble with an in-between move. So rook to h5 check. Now, if black simply moves his king somewhere to g8 or g7, white takes the rook, and then white's better, maybe winning. So black needs to attack the rook, and again it looks like white's in trouble. If he takes on f2, black takes on h5 and wins just as before. But yet another in-between move, rook to d5. Now this attacks black's bishop, so if black's rook moves, white takes the bishop, and it's a draw. So he needs to protect his rook and move his bishop. So bishop to b6 is the only try here. And now again white's down a piece, but he has a way to get it back. He plays rook to d6 check. Black moves his king forward, king f5. And now rook takes b6. So now if black simply takes back on b6, white takes on f2, and we have a draw. White king comes over and catches black's pawn. So black, of course, first removes white's f-pawn. Rook takes f3 check. And now the final point here is that, okay, if king takes f3, black takes on b6. And black has the opposition. So it's white's move. So white plays king e3. He needs to head over toward the pawn. King e5, king d3, king d5, king c3, king c5, king b3, king b5, in this basic endgame position. White has to step aside with his king. For example, king a3, king c4, and king b2. Black regains the opposition, and as we've all seen, this is win for black. And pawn promotes. So however, white plays a shocking move here. Instead of taking the rook, he plays king to g2, losing a tempo. Now, if the black rook moves, say rook to a3, now black's up a pawn, but this is a drawn position. Black's king is cut off. White's king simply moves over. I think the best move would be rook to d6. Black's king is cut off, and white king steps over into the corner easily, no problem, and it's a draw. So black needs to take the rook. So he takes, and after king takes f3, now it's white that has the opposition. The black king is moving first, and white king follows him. So this is a basic drawn position after king e5, king e3, king d5, king d3, king c5, king c3, king b5, king b3. It's black's move, so white doesn't have to step aside. White follows him wherever he wants, wherever black goes. So, for example, king c5, king c3, and if black pushes the pawn, then the pawn gets in the way of his own king. King b3, b4, and again, basic endgame theory, we step straight back always. King c4, king c2, b3, king b2, king b4, and of course now it's very important to step straight back. King b1, king c3, king c1, b2, king b1, and now king b3 with a draw. So, nice little subtlety, and also we learn a little bit about king and pawn endings. So this has been International Master Bryan Smith, showing some endgame compositions, endgame studies. I hope that people will start to have enjoyed seeing some unusual occurrences in chess, some interesting, unusual, magical positions. And perhaps people will become interested in finding some books also on these studies. There are many books on studies, collections. So this has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com. Goodbye.